legal paths to get.
Even the illegal crimes we're presenting.
Well, climb.
Maybe you should have illegal paths instead of legal paths.
All right. Let this, everyone got their, everything else away except for, all right, let's go.
Upon arrival in what was then the Idaho Territory, settlers and gold seekers established what governments to bring order and justice to the chaotic and isolated settlements of the territory. Sidney Edgerton, who recently arrived as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Idaho Territory, traveled to Washington, D.C. to negotiate creation of a new territory. President Abraham Lincoln and Congress supported the endeavor and signed the Organic Act, which created the Montana Territory on May 26, 1864. Lincoln later appointed Edgerton the first territorial governor, and Edgerton identified Bannack as the interim territorial capital. The built environment of Bannack reflected the town's gold camp status with crude, haphazardly constructed log buildings serving the transient and fluctuating population. Nonetheless, the town held the first jail of the territory and a cabin which proved suitable for government administration. The first representative governing body, the Montana Territorial Legislature, met in Bannack during the winter of 1864 to 1865. In the first session, the legislature voted to move the territorial capital to the thriving mining and population center of Virginia City. The mixture of log and frame structure is a bit more refined than Bannack, but would house territorial officials, courts, and the legislature for nearly all of the territory's first crucial decade of existence. The election of August 1874 resulted in the designation of Helena as the territorial capital, though the election was disputed and not decided in favor of Helena by the Montana Territorial Supreme Court until 1875. Many remember the election of 1894 as a duel between William A. Clark in support of Helena and Marcus Daly in support of Anaconda. Both men were among Butte's copper kings. Leading up to the election, both Clark and Daly spent significant money promoting their choice for the capital. Records suggest that each vote in the election cost nearly $56, a sum that was unheard of at the time. In this time, it would be about $1,500 per vote. Leading up to the election, a variety of pamphlets were published by both the Helena Capital Committee and the Anaconda Capital Committee, promoting the applauded aspects of their given towns. One pamphlet, titled Anaconda, Montana, 1894, suggests that Anaconda was the best choice for the permanent capital because, quote, Anaconda is the home of the Plain people as have built up Great Falls, Butte, and Missoula, as other prosperous cities of the state, clearly leaving Helena unnamed. Further, they suggested that Helena had a reputation as a city of snobs. And they were kind of right. Helena argued that Helena is, quote, everybody's town. Anaconda is a one-man's town, referring to the fact that Marcus Daly owned most of Anaconda and its industry. The Helena Capital Committee published their own satirical document titled Helena's Social Supremacy, which is right here, commenting at one point that even the town's robbers showed proper etiquette. This is between Helena and Anaconda, the men who wear silk hats. Clearly, Helena's more sophisticated. We have more people who wear silk hats. As the election results came in, Helena took an early lead, being favored by the eastern counties. The surprise was that Helena had captured nearly 40% of the Butte vote and thus took the election. But to say it was a close race would be an understatement. According to Montana Stories of the Land, a difference of 1,910 votes and a margin of 1.8% made Helena the state capital instead of Anaconda. Returns were projected onto a canvas hung on a neighboring building as the results were received by the Helena Independent. Dave Walter, a research librarian at the Montana Historical Society, wrote November 3rd, 1994, a story in the Independent Record. Quote, the local and state elections were nearly all forgotten for the interest centered on the capital vote. He continued, an estimated 1,500 people packed Broadway and Main Street to watch the results. I think I'm on the wrong slide. That's okay. They just deleted two of my slides. Okay, well.
Which one did you want?
No, they're just not there. They were supposed to be right back there, but that's okay. It was just more about the celebration of the election itself. 2,500 people gathered on the streets to celebrate the end of the election of Helena. So Helena's our capital city. Oh no, wait. Great. Yes, this, okay, celebrate. Yes, there we go. Okay. Right. The aftermath of the election was rife with allegations of fraud. Many believe that the election was one of the most corrupt in U.S. history, with accusations of ballot tampering and manipulation. The intense rivalry between Clark and Daley fueled these allegations, as both men sought to ensure their preferred city become the capital. Accounts from various legislators, such as Fred Whiteside and other workers of the acclaimed capital, showcase a few of these accusations, and they turned into a lawsuit eventually. The Capitol Commission is accused of corruption by Daley and his supporters, and State Representative Fred Whiteside leads the Fifth Legislative Assembly's investigation. When John C. Paulson dies before he can testify, the prosecution is left without its key witness. Without Paulson, both the Assembly and the Lewis and Clark County Grand Jury find the evidence inconclusive, but Governor Robert Smith removes the implicated commissioners for practicality's sake. I couldn't find a picture of John C. Paulson, so you get Larry Flatbush instead.
I thought that was him. Fine.
However, 40 years later, in the coming of the Great Depression of Montana, the building that was used to count the votes was being torn down to make way for new architectural structures to be built in downtown Florida. Was found during this demolition, however, were hundreds of ballots for the city of Anaconda to become Montana's capital city. Those aren't the ballots, but I thought that's funny. This newfound evidence, if a few decades late, showed that the variety of ballot counters within the Capitol Commission were taking votes for Anaconda and shoving them within the walls of the electoral building when the actual counting was being done.
Spin.
That's our first governor. I should put it up there. This amount of fraud was enough in the quote close call election to shift the final selection of the capital city to go from Anaconda to Helena. And by the time the physical evidence was collected, it was 4 decades too late to change the standing of the towns themselves and their place within the state. They were like halfway through building the actual Capitol building at that point, so it was kind of difficult to change everything. Well, there was no one person criminal to blame for the crime due to the fact that there were dozens of ballot counters within the building during the time of the 1894 election, and we had no security cameras or really security, period. There is not one specific person or persons to blame. That doesn't mean the controversy, I skipped too far. This doesn't mean the controversy was one of simply fading into another fluke of Montana state history. However, as the known fact of this immense fraud has seeped into the caution that Montanans take to the polls every election from 1934 and counting. It is important to remember that every fraudulent vote that is cast and counted invalidates the vote of an actual voter. We have many close elections in this country, and plenty of people stand to gain financially or through increased access to powerful figures who have incentive to cheat, as well as some individuals who just want to provide a boost to their preferred candidates. Americans deserve to have an electoral process that they can trust and that protects their most sacred right, and they have the right to know when that integrity of the process is. That was my evaluation. I just said it's like me looking like the mafia boss. So good.
Ah. That's cool. Thank you. Yeah, what a great story. How long? So what year did they find all the ballots?
1934.
Jeez. I knew the story. I forgot it was that long after.
Yeah,
And so years.
just a couple years. Yeah,
World War One.
you know, nothing happened between 1894 and 1934. Clearly,
So
especially
Clark got a pretty cheap victory.
yeah.
Oh my
Well,
God.
the funniest part of the whole story is William Clark didn't actually care whether Helena was the state capital or not. He just hated Marcus Daly so much that he didn't want Anaconda to be the capital, and he knew that Marcus Daly hated Helena, so he was like, "Let's advocate for Helena," and ended up spending. I think Marcus Daly spent $2 million on the election itself, and William Clark only spent 500,000.
On places to high ballots.
Well, yeah.
He spent more wise. And that is a great story. Good pictures. All right, good job. Now, Montana was easily one of the most corrupt states in the union. And that's saying. Okay, who wants to go next? Okay.
Okay, I do have a little packet that I'm gonna pass around for you guys to read. I'm doing the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, but I printed out some of his letters that he wrote in the last month of him being alive in prison. And he was like known for being a super good writer. And I'll like talk more about it, but you can't really fully understand him as a person until you read the letter. So I'm just gonna pass those around. And there's four. It goes from August 4th to the night before. So. Yeah. Yeah, just like you can skim it and read it and then pass it back. Read as much as you want to. Okay. I did the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, and I'll just start by saying that this case isn't honestly like, it's not very gruesome. It's mostly social and political, and that's the main standpoint. So the era of this was during the Industrial Revolution. So like a lot of factories were being made. It took place in Massachusetts in the 1920s. And it was like the onset of the Great Depression. One crucial thing was that Woodrow Wilson was president at the time, and his whole campaign and election was really based around like the enemy within and just his negative view about immigrants and like how they're going to bring communism and anarchism to the United States. Another thing that was also happening at this time, what I found to be really important, was the Red Raids, also known as the Palmer Raids, which was surrounded about around the Red Scare, and like anarchists and communists, specifically immigrants, were being arrested and deported on a mass scale. So 6,000 were arrested, and then 556 immigrants were deported based off of these accusations. And then, okay, so there's two guys. There's Sacco and then there's Vanzetti. Sacco's full name was Nicola Sacco. He was a shoemaker and night watchman. He had a wife at the time of the crime and a son named Dante, and he had a daughter who's on the way, whose name ended up being Inez. So he was born April 22nd of 1891. And something that I found really interesting about his experience with the crime and his family's experience was that this Supreme Court justice at the time invited Sacco's wife to stay in his home, in a home near the courthouse, along with his son. So they were able to visit him while he was in prison. And one of the things that I found particularly heartbreaking is that his 7-year-old son, Dante, would play catch by throwing the ball over the jail wall with him every day by standing out on the sidewalk. And then he was also from Torre Maggiore of Foggia in the Apulia region. So they were both Italian immigrants. And yes, sorry. And then Vanzetti was not like, he didn't really work in factories. He was more of an entrepreneur and writer, but he also was a fishmonger, and that plays into his alibi. Something about Vanzetti is that, like I was saying, he was a really good writer, but most people who met him did not think that he was guilty. There was a lot of really famous writers that met him during his time in prison and talked about how it would be really, really strange if someone would bring him to a crime, and that it just didn't seem like with his conscience that he would be capable of doing such a thing. And he was born June 11th of 1888, and his fellow prisoners at Charleston State Prison described him as being a bookish intellectual, incapable of committing any violence. That's what I was saying. And then I'll get into more of the writers that visited him during his time there. So the crime. There's technically two crimes that are related to this. And I want to start off by saying that Sacco and Vanzetti both came to the US in 1908, and they didn't meet until 1917, as they both had anarchist ideologies. And so they followed this one guy named Luigi Galliani. And how they kind of really started to meet was that he was encouraging with a protest that his followers go to Mexico to avoid the draft for World War I. So both of them did this, and they fled to Mexico in the spring of 1917, and then they came back in September, and that will come back into the trial. But so the two crimes, the main one is the one that happened on April 15th of 1920, and that was in Braintree, Massachusetts. And so that happened at the Slater Moral Shoe Company factory. And what ended up happening is that there were some people who ended up shooting two people, a paymaster and a guard. And their names were Frederick Parmenter and Alessandro Berardelli. It was a robbery for their payroll boxes. So they were being transported by those two men, and there was 15 grand in there. And witnesses, once they were arrested, said that they recognized Sacco. Remotely, no one said they recognized Vanzetti at the time. The other crime that plays into this was the one that happened at Bridgewater, Massachusetts in 1919. And this was at the White Shoe Factory, and so this one was a failed robbery, so they tried to steal $33,000 and failed. They're believed to be 4 to 5 Italian individuals involved. They were also assumed to be anarchists, and part of this was because of the police force in Massachusetts just kind of made a lot of assumptions regarding that, and then witnesses for that crime were more likely to say that they identified things. So, the evidence and the arrest. I'll start with the arrest. So, like I was saying, the police made a lot of assumptions, and so after the Braintree crime, they said, "Oh, we think this guy named Kawachi was involved," and so the police went to his house that they presumed, and he was living with a guy named Mario Boda. However, Kawachi was no longer living there, but they still were making those assumptions, and so they decided to follow Mario, and they found his car at an auto shop, and they were tracking his car in specific, which was strange because his car did not match the description whatsoever for the crime. But they still were questionable of it. And so they told the guys in the garage to hold them back so that when they got there, they could question Boda, because Boda was not there at the time. And so when Boda got there, he arrived with 4 other individuals, but the garage people were obviously trying to hold him up, and it became a little bit suspicious, and so they all fled. However, on May 5th of 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti were 2 of the individuals that were found on a tree cart, I believe, and they were stopped and arrested. And when they were arrested, they were found to both be carrying firearms, and there was a lot of lies that took place. And so they were both very, very afraid of being deported. And so when they were initially arrested, they said a lot of things that were true. They claimed to not know Mario. They claimed to not be carrying firearms, which was quickly discovered. They claimed that they weren't anarchists, just a lot of stuff. But also part of the arrest that I thought was really unjust was the fact that they weren't told what they were being charged with until the next day. So a lot of the lies that took place in that initial arrest was before they even knew what they were being charged with. They had no idea. And then I will get back to the evidence with the trial, because there's a lot, and a lot of it does not make sense because it shouldn't have been used. So the trial, I'll start with the first trial that happened was for Vanzetti. And so Vanzetti was charged with robbery, like the attempted robbery, and with murder of the Braintree crimes. And the robbery was associated with the Bridgewater crime because more witnesses identified him for that crime. So what they did is they had Vanzetti's trial first, which was really uncommon considering he had a lesser charge. And it was for the Bridgewater crimes, which were obviously attempted and failed. And so his lawyer at the time was Vahey, and Vahey avoided the word anarchy at all costs. Like, he did not want that to be brought up, even though it was very prevalent in the trial. He also focused very heavily on his alibi. So Vanzetti was peddling fish and making deliveries, which was verified with numerous customers on that day. And 5 witnesses said that he was there at the crime, and more than 2 times as many said he was not. Vanzetti didn't testify on his own defense, which really hurt his case. And then he ended up being found guilty of assault with attempt to rob, and was given a 12 to 15-year sentence, and was now perceived as a convicted felon. And part of the reason why that sentence was so severe for the crime that he was ultimately charged with was because the judge for all of these cases was so incredibly corrupt. His name was Webster Thayer. He had publicly said previously that he strong hater of anarchy and did not like immigrants. And there was a previous trial that he also had where he convicted an immigrant, and part of that was also based off of his like anti-immigrant, anti-anarchy bias. So at this point, Vanzetti is now a felon. So when they do the murder trial for Sacco and Vanzetti for the Braintree murders, it made it more likely for him to be convicted because he actually had basically no connection to the Braintree crime, like whatsoever. But they wanted him to be convicted, and so they thought it would help if he was a felon first. So with the murder trial, Fred Moore was now their defense attorney. And so Fred Moore was a leftist attorney from the West Coast, specifically California, and Thayer did not like that. Like, picture how Montanans don't like Californians. That's how Thayer felt about Fred Moore. And so that already set the trial off on a really, really bad note. And then the other thing that was really corrupt about this was the jury selection. So the jury selection for this trial At the time, Massachusetts, the only thing that could happen if you were convicted of first degree murder was the death sentence. That was the only option. And so when the prosecution was choosing the jury, they specifically excused people who expressed negative thoughts about the punishment of the death penalty, and they specifically picked people who were fine with the death penalty. So they were more likely to be convicted because they didn't think it was such a severe punishment. And so the prosecution had some really, really wild approaches, and it's gonna get confusing because their evidence ultimately does not line up, and we know this now. But especially then in the 1920s, it was a little bit harder with some of the ballistics evidence and stuff like that. So the first thing that the prosecution really focused on was that if they were innocent, they would have no problem speaking freely. So especially they referenced the day of their arrest and how they lied a lot. And once again, this was not true considering that they were lying about that because because of their fear of being deported, which had something to do with the red raids. And then the other thing is that the defense team really focused on their alibis. And so Vanzetti had a pretty good alibi and couldn't really be associated with it, like I said, because there was no association with him there. He had a lot of people who testified that they saw him that day. And so Sacco didn't necessarily have a good alibi. Technically he did, but they didn't believe it. So Sacco testified on April 15th of 1920 that he had taken the day off from work and had traveled to Boston to request a passport from the Italian consulate. And several witnesses testified that they saw Sacco en route to Boston or in Boston. And Sacco also offered the photo that he attempted to use to obtain the passport. But an official from the consulate testified that he rejected the photo because of its large size and that its size made it memorable. And that while discussing the photo with other members of the consulate, he clearly observed the date on a large calendar, but this was ignored. There was a lot of things that they said that would have proved them to be innocent that were just fully ignored because of the anti-immigrant, anti-Italian, anti-anarchist sentiment. So the other thing, like I was talking about, was the prosecution's main evidence mostly consisted of the weapons and the ballistic evidence, which was not an exact science in 1921. So what they claimed is that the weapons that they were carrying the night of their arrest were connected to the murders. So Vanzetti was carrying a .38 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver, which they said was taken from Berardelli at the murder. And this was completely false, which the prosecution knew. And we have more evidence of this now than they were able to provide then. Berardelli's gun was actually purchased by the Parmenter, who was the paymaster. So it wasn't his necessary gun, but they were able to trace it back to the store it was purchased. And the gun was actually a .32 caliber, not a .38. And the serial number also did not match the gun that was found on Vanzetti, but this wasn't found out until 56 years later, and they also purposely withheld this evidence. And then for Sacco, the jurors said that the bullet that killed Berardelli came from a .32 caliber Colt weapon, which Sacco was carrying the night of their arrest. One prosecution witness, Captain William Proctor, who was a police firearms expert, stopped short of saying that the ballistics test proved Sacco's weapon fired the fatal bullet, which they called bullet 3, and just said the bullet wasn't consistent with the type of bullet that would be fired from Sacco's weapon. And bullet 3 was also used as evidence, and we now know was not fired on the day of the murders. They believe that it was fired sometime between May and December of 1920 at a test range somewhere, possibly for police test range, and some believe that it was substituted for the bullet found in Berardelli's body to purposely convict them. And then the other thing is that police investigators purposely withheld evidence that cartridges found at the Braintree murders did not match the cartridges found in the weapons fired by Sacco and Vanzetti. So the other thing that there is the cap. And so I don't know if you guys know the O.J. Simpson trial as well, which I'm pretty sure one of you guys are doing. But you know how he had the glove and they used it to say, oh, the glove doesn't fit him. He didn't do it. So a very similar thing happened with Sacco. They found this cap at the crime scene. And so they used this cap and were like, look, the cap fits Sacco. It did not fit Sacco. It was way too small, was sitting on the top of his head. They even realized that he didn't really have that many caps at his house. The day of the robbery and murders, a gray cloth cap with a torn lining was found near Berardelli's body, where Berardelli's body had fallen. The prosecution claimed that it resembled one owned by Sacco, Testimony indicated that Sacco hung his cap on a nail while at work, and prosecutors claimed that the nail tore the lining. This cap was not the same size as the other caps found at Sacco's home. The prosecution asked Sacco to try on the cap. Sacco said it was too small. The prosecution maintained that it fit, even though it very much did not. And then in 1927, prior to the executions, one of the chief of police in Braintree from 1905 to 1926 stated that he had actually torn the cap's lining to see if he could find any marks inside for identification. And that was also not revealed in the trial. So that's great. And then Fred Moore, this trial, had Vanzetti and Sacco testify on their own behalf. And then Katzman, who is the prosecutor for this, used that. It was a lose-lose situation. He used it to expose their radicalism and use patriotic sympathies to make the jurors agree with him. So he used the fact that they fled to Mexico against them, and this ended up making them both say that they did not believe in war, which did not sit well with the jury, who was also corrupt in the way they were chosen. And then Sacco went on to add that he didn't believe in capitalism and was not a patriot. So that didn't help either. And so on July 14th of 1921, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before reaching a decision that they were guilty. And the things that led to this was that the alibi witnesses were not believed that Sacco and Vanzetti had because they were Italian and because they were friends of the defendants. And then another thing that also led to this guilty conviction was that Moore never challenged the weak ballistic evidence that the prosecution had, or asked the jurors if it made sense for an anarchist to shoot a guard and a paymaster, because it wasn't the kind of thing that anarchists generally stood for. They were really into bombs. So I don't know if you were in your guys' AP US history class last year, but those bomb-throwing anarchists, that was mainly their thing. And so in Sacco and Vanzetti's mind, shooting someone was a different kind of violence than bombing someone, because they generally wanted to gain more publicity to make more social political statement rather than just pointless violence. So after this, it keeps going. So they got a new defense attorney, and this guy was named William G. Thompson. He was a Boston trial lawyer, and he said in a letter to one of his friends that he thought they had nothing to do with the crime that they were charged with. And he said that after he had initially researched the whole thing and it got through the whole trial. And so the appeals he ended up appealing to Webster Thayer, the really corrupt judge. And he said this because of the prejudice that Thayer had in the anti-anarchist statements that Webster Thayer had made. But the thing with Massachusetts, also the problem with their judicial system at the time, is that the judge who had the initial trial also got to choose whether he wanted to see the appeals. So he said no, because why would he say yes? He was really corrupt and they were accusing him of prejudice. So he said no. And then it came out that Thayer was at a football game in 1924 at Dartmouth, and told a professor of government there, "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards the other day? I guess that will hold them for a while." And the professor made this public knowledge a little bit later because of his concern about the prejudice. And so at this point, after the first appeal was denied, William G. Thompson realized that the only way to prove them innocent was to find the actual perpetrators of the crime. And guess what? You would think that's not going to happen. It did, actually. So this guy named Medeiros, who was in the same prison as Sacco and Vanzetti, confessed that he had participated in South Braintree murders, and like in a letter too. And he gave it to Vanzetti. And he said that he was one of the suspects in the automobile with the gang of Italians. And he said that they were from Providence, Rhode Island. He didn't name them, but he said that they made their living robbing freight cars in Providence. And yeah, and so they ended up finding a guy that perfectly matched his description, and this guy was Joseph Morelli. And the day that most of this gang that he was talking about, the day of those murders, they were out on bail, awaiting another trial for another South Braintree crime, which happened to be stealing shoe shipments from a factory adjacent to the one that the two murder victims were employed at. So you would think that would be pretty strong. And then Medeiros also provided more evidence and background about the crime, saying that they actually used two cars when originally they thought there was just this one dark blue Buick involved with the runaway. And that he said that the cars were switched immediately after the robbery, and he also disclosed where they were switched. So he provided a lot of evidence. And then the other thing that I found to be very interesting is that Sacco looked very, very similar to Morelli. And part of this is that they were both Italian. And so the witnesses that couldn't confidently identify Sacco or Vanzetti all confidently identified Morelli as being involved with that crime. So even with all that evidence, Judge Thayer denied the appeal again. And so at this point, the defense's team's only like chance was to file for request clemency from the Massachusetts governor, whose name was Alvin Ford, and he had appointed Harvard President A. Lawrence Lowell to evaluate. And Lowell said, no, the trial was fairly conducted. And now it's known, I'm pretty sure, or it's very highly believed, that they started drafting this report before they had heard all the evidence from Sacco and Vanzetti's defense team. So that was really sad. And that's one of the letters that's in the thing that I showed you guys. Was the first letter was Vanzetti's letter he wrote right after he found out that the Massachusetts governor was refusing the clemency. So public backlash was really, really high throughout this whole trial. One of the things, like I talked about, was the Supreme Court justice that moved them, and he also was involved with an article with Atlantic Monthly saying that they were innocent. There were protests all over the globe. Like in every single major city, there was a protest. There was strikes regarding it. And then the other thing that probably did not help their case is that Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, really wanted them to be seen as innocent. And he tried to pressure American authorities for them to be released, which I'm sure did not help. And they also didn't like fascists, but that's a whole other thing. Two other people that were also very prominent figures that responded to the backlash was Albert Einstein and H.G. Wells. So the War of the Worlds thing that we watched earlier in class today, that was that author. And he said that they were innocent. He signed a petition for their release. Both of them are socialists. Albert Einstein, I'm sure most of you know, also signed that same petition. And then more public backlash. And I wasn't able to put all of it on here because there's a lot. But more public backlash is that the industrial workers of the world did a 3-day nationwide walkout. And they also obviously believe they were innocent. I'm going to get back to the bomb guy. But Upton Sinclair, author of The Jungle, which we also talked about last year in AP US History, was pretty unclear about his opinion, but he wrote a whole novel about it, which was like a fictional interpretation of the case, titled Boston. And he was never super clear on what his opinion was, but he did say that he had a conversation with Fred Moore, their initial defense attorney, who said that Sacco was guilty and that he had made up their alibis. But a lot of stuff points to that not being true. And then the other guy is John Dos Passos, and he was the author of Facing the Chair, Story of Americanization of Two Foreign-Born Workmen. Sorry. And so he said that Sacco might be guilty, but it was really unlikely that Vanzetti was. And then that's what I was talking about, where he said nobody in his right mind who was planning such a crime would take that man along. And that was when he was referring to Vanzetti. Now, here's the kind of funny, absurd part. So this guy, Severino Di Giovanni, loved bombs. So he's an anarchist, right? And he immigrated to Argentina, and he was part of the Galleanist anarchist group, which was led by the same guy, Luigi Galleani, who encouraged them to go to Mexico for that draft. And so he wrote in newspapers about how he was so against like how that trial was going. And he even had his own newspaper that he wrote about. And so several hours after the death sentence, he bombed the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was arrested, tortured for 5 days, refused to give anything, and then was released because he gave no evidence. And then the U.S. Embassy made a newspaper article calling the Sacco and Vanzetti individuals common criminals and referencing their Italian background. And that made him really mad. And so the next day he bombed the George Washington statue in Palermo, Buenos Aires. And then guess what he did? He bombed the Ford Motor Company. And then he bombed the house of the federal police officer in charge of the entire investigation regarding those 2 other bombs. And then he helped lead a 24-hour strike in Buenos Aires after the execution. And then Sacco's widow ended up thanking him and told him about this cigarette company who was going to name their cigarette brand after Sacco and Vanzetti. So then he bombed the cigarette company. And then he bombed 2 prominent banks, one in New York, one in Boston. And then he tried to bomb President Hoover's train when he came to Argentina. I think you get the point. There was more. But those are some of the more prominent ones. He was not happy, to say the least. So then the next thing is the execution, and this is really, really sad. So both of the men refused to see a priest several times on their last day because they declared being atheist, which was one of the things, but their execution was scheduled for October 22nd at midnight in 1927. On August 21st, which is one of the letters I passed around, Vanzetti wrote to Dante, who was 13 years old at the time and was Sacco's son, and said he knew that his father wasn't guilty and described him as being the bravest man he had ever met. And so continuing on, those are just some of the people who were involved at the time. So Robert G. Elliott was the executioner, and then Warden Henry, Deputy Warden Hoxett, Dr. McLaughlin, and 2 guards were there at the time of their execution by the electric chair. So the first guy to be executed first, ironically, was Medeiros, the guy who confessed to the crime, but it was not for that crime that he was being executed. He was killed first. He was strapped in at 12:02 and was declared dead at 12:09. The next person to be strapped in was Sacco, and Sacco was pronounced dead at 12:19. His last words were "farewell, mother," but he also said things like "farewell, my wife and child and all my friends," and "vive la anarchie." So he was still very prevalent about his ideology. And then Vanzetti was the last person to be executed. And when he entered, he shook hands of the prison warden and thanked him for his kindness. And some people say that the warden was crying when he flicked the switch to turn on the electric chair for him. But his final words were, "I wish to forgive some people for what they're doing to me, for what they are now doing to me." And he was pronounced dead at 12:26. After they were executed, death masks were made before they were cremated. And the next day, there was a really, really, really large funeral, and hundreds of thousands gathered in the streets. But hundreds of thousands ended up gathering in the streets, specifically on Hanover Street, and to be involved in the funeral procession. And there was still more protests around the world the day they were executed as well. And a lot of those pictures and footage, things of the funeral procession are not there anymore. And like, this was the only one that I could find, because I forget what his name is, but there was a guy who was a politician, also anti-immigrant, anti-anarchist, who had become more involved in the movie industry, and he ordered that a lot of those tapes be destroyed. But on August 23rd of 1977, which was the 50th anniversary of their executions, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation that Sacco and Vanzetti had been unfairly tried and convicted, and that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. And the proclamation did not include a pardon, because the pardon would imply that they were guilty, but he also didn't say that they're innocent either. And this was just some of the things that had been done in their legacy, but 6 poems, 15 books and novels, 9 songs, 9 films about them, and then 9 films and like television episodes that mention them have been made, and 5 plays were produced about them. So my evaluation is that I think they were most definitely both innocent. I mean, the entire trial was just so unjust, and I believe that Judge Sarah should have been removed. The jury was also so corrupt in the fact that they were intentionally picked to make them more likely to convict him, especially with the fact that the witnesses on Sacco and Vanzetti's behalf weren't believed, also because they were Italian, and the prosecution used evidence that wasn't true and shouldn't have been able to be used. And yeah, that's my evaluation. So thank you.
John? What year were they executed in?
What?
What year were they executed in?
1947.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is one other thing that I was just thinking about last night, but I found this case to be very similar to the one that's currently happening with Luigi Mangione, and just the sense of like how they were identified and some of the evidence being used. So yeah, just kind of interesting how some of that still transfers now.
Okay, good job. All right, nice. Okay, we only got a few minutes, but we can get started on one. Let's get started. We get like the introduction
Yeah,
of the crime of the century.
of the current stage.
And here's the thing, I know, I would say, how long we want to do these, but people are really getting into these. And I want to do them. I want to commit the crimes. No, I want, because these are great. And I'm glad everyone's enthusiastic about what we're doing. So this is a lot of fun.
So I have a crime of the century. This is a case very, very similar to Sacco and Vanzetti, except they very much did do it. It was 100% them. There's no doubt about it. All right. Okay. Basics. What happened? I'm gonna go a very quick overview of what took place. Two teenagers, Leopold and Loeb, ages 19 and 18 respectively, kidnapped, then killed 14-year-old Bobby Robert Franks. Very brief thing of what happened. What historical context? So, post World War I America, so lots of social uneasiness and economic instability. Prohibition fueled a lot of organized crime and widespread unemployment, so it caused a lot of disillusionment among young Americans. Intellectual movements such as Nietzsche's, I forget Nietzschean philosophy were circulating among educated elites. So that picture just from the Prohibition for We Won't Be Here, and I thought it was fun. This case is quite perplexing and will most likely be a hard struggle to save the lives of these boys. That is their lawyer in the case, and he actually managed to save their lives, but shouldn't have, I don't think. Who were the killers? They are probably the most interesting part of the case. While the trial was quite impressive for the time, they themselves as individuals really set the scene for what happened and why it took place in the first place. So this is Nathaniel Leopold Jr. He was born in Kenwood, Chicago, to a wealthy Jewish family. His father, Nathan Leopold Sr., retired as a millionaire after a successful career in paper box manufacturing. He was very intelligent. Leopold he entered the University of Michigan at age 15 and later graduated Phi Beta Kappa from University of Chicago at only 18. He was then planning to attend Harvard Law after a trip to Europe. He obviously was a law major and he wanted to be a lawyer. And that's kind of prevalent in some of the letters he wrote later on. I included a snippet from my favorite one. That is probably my favorite paragraph ever written in the history of forever. But he was super insecure and he was bullied and made fun of a lot. And he did not have a good relationship with his father at all. In comparison to Loeb, he was called awkward, ugly, non-social. No one really liked him, so he just retreated into his intelligence. He spoke 5 languages fluently and learned 15. And he was an amateur ornithologist, so he liked birds a lot. But yeah, he was very emotionally unstable and was very fixated on the idea of intellectual superiority. And so he prided himself very heavily on that. And then here's Richard Loeb. His father was Albert Loeb, a lawyer and vice president at Sears. Why didn't it come up? Oh, at Sears Roebuck & Co. He graduated from the University of Michigan at 17, reportedly the youngest graduate at the time period. So he's also very intelligent. But people compared him and said he was charming, handsome, socially adept. They loved him, except he had a history of crime and he loved adventure and risk. So he committed like small theft crimes at first and would like do little things like that and rope some of his friends in. And he also really liked to read detective fiction and had an obsession with crime. So he had like the opposite side of the coin from Leopold, and he was a lot more on the I'm going to take action side, but he was much more emotionally stable and had a good relationship with his parents. He also called his mom Momsy and Popsy. So I think that tells you what you need to know about that. He was also from the rich Jewish family in Kenwood, so very close in just geographic location.
Okay, perfect place to stop right there. We'll get to the
Yeah.
relationship tomorrow, all right?
Yes.
Good. Hey, many applause. Good. Nice job. All right, good. Well, thank you for starting. Perfect thought. So we got the introduction, and now you have to figure out how they became friends.
Yes.
All of you have, that's your assignment for tonight. Write down how you think they became friends.
Bingo? Yes.
Oh, bingo?
I guess they're not single parents.
All right, nice. We'll pick him up tomorrow. Very well done. Do you guys want to hear an earworm? Yeah, I think this one.